next year in Tampa. But it is interactive. I do encourage questions at any point in time. There is some raising of hands. Obviously, I can't see you, so I'll try to predict what if your hand's raised or not. But I'll go over some of the typical things that users, the typical questions as well that I get at the summit. But feel free to either enter in the chat or raise your hand at any point in time, and Trish can interrupt me. We want to make sure that this is as interactive as possible. You're here to potentially get some questions answered about security. You have some specific needs potentially from your security implementation or where you're at with security. So we want to make sure that you use the resources we have here to get you where you need to be. All right, so this first slide talks a little bit about us. We've participated as an organization in the user group since the inception. So we were out at the user group in Seattle, there in Redmond, for the first time. And if you guys aren't part of the user group, we definitely encourage you to be. It's definitely something that's worthwhile. You get resources. Like me, for example, but it's also an opportunity for you to interact with the rest of the user community to go ahead and get those types of questions answered. I know there were a number of people that came up to me and during sessions or after sessions or just while we were talking that had specific issues about things like payroll, those types of things. I was able to connect them with another user that's potentially having the same problem. Those types of things, and oops, sorry about that. I was able to connect with them as far as giving them the resources that they need, and it's a great opportunity. So my favorite benefit of the user groups and of our community, and certainly Fastpath as a community as well, is to the opportunity to collaborate. So we also had our user group, our Fastpath user group. It's called FBUG. We had that in Reno as well, and really love to see all you guys there. It gives us an opportunity to get you to ask questions about the kinds of problems you're having, the kinds of things that people are implementing as it relates to security, as it relates to compliance, really anything. And it gets our users talking to each other. We take our user input very seriously. You guys are very important to us to get to the next level and to get those types of compliance things into our software and make sure that you understand, that we understand your needs and are putting those into our application. So a little bit about me. I've been working with GP for a long time, and so at any point in time during this, you can ask me questions. This is going to be specific to the security model, but we certainly can get into other things if need be. A little bit about us. Obviously, we are audit security compliance solutions for Dynamics GP. We also work with the other Dynamics products, as well as we're kind of branching out into NetSuite and Intact and some other ERPs. So if you have our compliance solutions for GP and you like them, and you have other compliance needs as it relates to those enterprise applications, we certainly can talk to you about managing those needs. All right, so the agenda today, we're going to talk about you, or I'm going to talk about you. And again, I'm going to assume where we're at and talk to you a little bit about your implementation, where you're at with that, how you can take that security implementation forward. Security is a living, breathing thing. So we definitely want to make sure that you're on top of your security implementation, that that you're putting effort into that and making sure that it's current. Basically, people tend to get a little complacent as it relates to signing security. They might have a user that's been with the company for 10 years, and as that user's or employees role change, they continually added security, but it may not have redacted any of that security, so or reduced any of their security. So it is good to go and do a reassessment and understand where you're at in your security, who has access to what, and kind of bring that back down. If you haven't gone through that security implementation, or maybe you're in a situation where you did the upgrade from 9 or GP9 and you know you kind of have a mess with security, we can talk about, and we'll talk about how you can get to a better place with your security. I'm also going to just briefly introduce the role-based model and make sure that everybody understands you know, what that role-based model is, how that changed from previous versions of GP, and then talk to you about maybe the differences. So for everybody on the call, I'll talk about the GP versions, but for the most part, what we're talking about is the modern security model as far as GP is concerned. So GP10 and higher is what we're going to focus on today. I'll talk to you about user setup. There's a few changes in user setup and what's new with GP 2013. I have 2013 on there just because for the most part, 2013 added a few things. With 2015, the security's the same. So there's a few things that they've added throughout the different versions, but for the most part, what you get today has been around since 2013. Roles and tasks, as many of you know, the role-based model, they introduced tasks, and those tasks have security objects, so I'll talk to you about that. Model profiles, I'll get into administrative access, you know, get on my soapbox about SA and whether or not you should be using the SA password or how many people should be using that. The security reporting is kind of a big deal in GP, and they don't have very good security reports, and so really from that perspective, obviously if you own our products, we're able to give you better security reporting, and I'll talk about that. But there are other resources out there that I'll talk about as well. Questions to consider as far as compliance is concerned. You know, you always want to be asking yourself in that implementation or before you give somebody access, you really want to ask yourself, am I causing a compliance risk, or am I causing a risk to my organization by giving this person access? Go through some tools. There are a lot of good tools out there. I know David Musgrave has the support debugging tool, which he's renamed the GP Power Tools. That's a great tool. There's also some kind of hidden tools in GP that I'll talk a little bit about. And then the security matrix. It's something I've developed. It's pretty simple, but basically at the end I'll show you the security matrix, and I've done a number of security implementations with GP. I've found that it's one of the easiest ways to really take that huge project that you have ahead of you and kind of compartmentalize it, and I can talk to you about that. If anybody on this call wants my information or to contact me, feel free to email me, and that information will be at the end. I'd be happy to send you my security matrix. It is an tabbed Excel spreadsheet that helps you through that security implementation. I would also be happy to share with you, I have a white paper on minimizing the use of SA, So again, at any point in time after this call, you can email me, and I'd be happy to send you that info. Okay. So we're going to talk about you, and you can raise your hand if you want. So how many people are on, GP 2010 or higher? I think most of you raised your hand. How many people are on GP 9 or GP 8? There's typically very few people that are on that, but there's a very distinct difference between the security model in GP 8 or GP 9 than 10, 2010, 2013, and 2015. Again, I'm going to talk mostly about the role-based security model today. If you're on one of those older models, it's obviously, you guys know, a lot of you know that it's very difficult. The biggest difference between the two models is the old version had an optimistic security model. That is, you got access to everything, and then the information was taken away from you. So if I wanted a user to not have access to customer maintenance, I'd have to explicitly go in there, change their group that they're assigned to, and say, okay, this group shouldn't have access to customer maintenance. So when they went to 2010, they came up with the role-based model. It's much better, but it's a pessimistic security. So out of the box, you don't have any access in GP, and so you have to grant access to roles for users, and that's going to give those users the ability to do the things in GP that they need to. But again, out of the box, they don't get any access, and so all of that access is granted. Are you using converted roles? So what this is really saying, and some of you, a lot of people are using converted roles, but they just don't know it. They might be on GP 2013 and are still using converted roles. So what that is asking, or what that's saying, is during the upgrade process from a previous role-based model or previous group-based model, GP 9 or GP 8, to GP 10 or GP 2010, you or your partner could have actually gone through the security upgrade process. That security upgrade process, what it does is it takes an individual, it takes their company information, and it will create one role and one task for each individual user company combination. So if you have a very large company, you can see how that, if you have 100 users and 100 companies, you're going to end up with 10,000 roles and 10,000 tasks, all that start with CNV. So if you're seeing some CNV roles out there, you really want to manage those. So what you want to do is you're going to want to go through a security implementation for anybody that's assigned to those roles, and then remove those roles. There's a process that can remove those roles from the system. The reason being, technically, what you're doing in that upgrade process with the CNV roles is you are giving the user the ability to do everything that they did before in the GP9 version or the GP8 version, but it's almost impossible to manage from a security implementation perspective. So you have to go to change security for a group of people like AP clerks, for example. You have to go into each one of their tasks and each one of their roles and go and change that information. It's much easier to choose to use the role-based model to consolidate everything into those roles that make up what an AP clerk should do. So definitely I would encourage you, if you have those CNV roles, to get off of those, to go ahead and remove those from the system. There's a number of problems that they cause. One of them, they slow down the system because there's so much data. It can actually slow down the login process for GP. It also slows down the initial opening of the window because of all of the security concerns there. So if you're having issues with the CNV roles, definitely get rid of those. So how many people have access or know the SA password, and probably most of you raised your hand. And how many people you know, have more than one person in their organization that have access to the SA password? And a number of you raised your hand. So, and how many people think that's a good idea, right? So some people think it's a good idea. Some people are not okay with it. I have a pretty big issue, and it's starting to become more of a concern from an audit perspective about using the SA password. So again, I've written a white paper called Minimizing the Use of SA in Dynamics, and what it does is it outlines the steps you need to take to elevate either your privileges or another user's privileges in your GP environment to give you the ability to do things like create users, create companies, perform upgrades. There are still some third parties that require the SA password. They're becoming few and far between. If you do have third parties or connections or other types of things where people are using the SA password, you should try to get off of that. The biggest risk to you personally would be that because you know that password and because somebody else knows it, that person can go in and make anonymous changes to your Dynamics environment. And that's an issue because your organization doesn't know if you did it or if they did it because you're logging in as the same user. So that's the biggest concern. The other concern is that it has full access to both the front end of GP, so you can do everything because you're assigned power user out of the box, right? And then you have back-end access to your Dynamics environment as well. I'm sorry, your SQL Server environment as well. So you can go into Management Studio, you can run queries, you can drop tables, you can drop databases, you can do all of those things. So it's a very, very powerful login. That gives you full access to everything. It's also anonymous, so that's really the issue. So again, I'll talk more about that white paper, but that's really the biggest concern. I get a lot of questions about the DynSA password as well. People say, is that good enough? DynSA is the same, has the same risks from an anonymous perspective. So if 5 people know the DynSA password, whoever logs in is making those changes anonymously. So that's still an issue. One thing that the DynSA doesn't have is the ability to log into the SQL Server backend and make those changes. So it's a little bit better. But again, I would rather see you elevate your GP logins permissions in SQL to give you the ability to create those create those users in the system, or to create companies, those types of things. Because you can give yourself essentially DynSA privileges. Then when you make a change, when you create a user, if there's any logging involved, if there's any audit trails involved, you're making that information, you're making those changes as yourself. So as an organization, you guys can keep track of who's actually making the changes in your system. And obviously when you get to a point where something, some kind of fraud has happened, and that's happening with an elevated password like this, it can be a pretty big issue, especially if you're one of the ones that knows the password. So how many power users do you have? More than one, more than 2, more than 3. So there are a number of you that have multiple power users in your system. We like to eliminate the use of power user as well. We would rather you grant full access to all of the roles rather than use power user. There's a number of reasons for that. One is power users is a programmatic role, and what that means is when you log into GP and you open the customer maintenance, if you're a power user, there's a little check that says, is this what roles is this person a part of? And with power user, it doesn't even run that check. So it just skips security for the entire GP environment. There's a couple issues with that. One, power users technically isn't a role, so when you run security reports, power users don't show up on those reports for things like, so if, let's say, for example, your CFO said, hey, show me everybody that can create a vendor in the system. So you go run your vendor report. It shows the 3 people in your system that can create a vendor. Power users is not going to be a part of that. That's one of the issues with it. The other issue is that nobody does everything in the system. So you can elevate that permission if necessary, and then reduce it. That would be the proper course of action. So if you, as an administrator, want to go in and say run a specific process because you're getting access denied errors or something on that, you want to elevate yourself to power user, go through that process to determine what forms or what reports you're running, and then remove that power user. That would be the best course of action. And then I have initial questions. A lot of times with a small group, I have everybody introduce themselves. If you have any questions so far, feel free to enter them in the chat, and I'd be happy to answer them. Alrighty. So here we have the security model, and you guys might be familiar with this. This gives you a little better picture of what actually is going on. The company is not on here, but there's also a company involved in this. But security is a Dynamics wide implementation. So all of your security data is stored in the Dynamics database and is available to all the companies. So you can have different access per company. A user can. So you're going to be assigned a company. That user is then assigned roles. So you can be assigned one or many roles. It just depends. A lot of people choose to do a role-based model where they take a user as a role, so an AP clerk, for example. So I'm going to define an AP clerk as a role. I'm going to figure out all of the tasks that AP clerk needs to do, and then I'm going to refine the operations potentially for that. So that's one good way to do it. It's certainly a good way to do it. Another way to look at it, though, is a role as a process, and some people do that. They customer maintenance, for example. If an AR clerk needs to create a customer, they should be assigned to that task. Then you have the operations all the way at the bottom. So that's the lowest level of access that you're giving. So an operation is going to be something like a customer maintenance form, a report. Those operations get assigned to tasks. Those tasks get assigned to roles, and those roles get assigned to users. Users are then assigned to companies. So it's a fairly straightforward model. It's a fairly easy security model to deal with once you can kind of get your arms wrapped around what you want to do or how you want to proceed. My recommendation would be to use, and what I've done in the past is to use that user-based model where we're defining an AP clerk or an AR clerk or that type of role Some people use names. You can do that, but obviously, as you get people leaving the environment, you don't want Sally's role out there. You can rename it or copy it if you want to, but again, people do lots of different things. There's no wrong way to implement security. It's whatever way you choose, but you want to be consistent. You want to make sure that it fits the way your company does business. All right, so now that we have an understanding of all of that, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the newer features in GP 2013 and security. So they've added this user called limited user, and where before you had full users and that was it, and I think there were some other self-service users, but they've just defined these as full users or limited users. So your full users are going to require a full license. So you bought 20 licenses for your Dynamics environment, so you have 20 full licenses. With the new licensing model, they've introduced this limited user. So if you have users like salespeople that aren't going in and actually changing anything, they're just doing inquiry and reporting, you should consider switching them to a limited user. Really going forward, when you're talking about relicensing or upping your licenses with Dynamics, what you want to evaluate is how many true full users do we need and how many limited users do we need. What you've bought so far, they don't reduce that in any way, so they won't send you a check for the ones you don't need. But going forward, definitely you want to look at who you could put into a limited bucket. I think it's four for one, so the cost differentiate. So it's 25% of what a full user is for a limited user. But again, they're limited to forms and reports that can't change the data. So there's a flag in that form. So there's a flag on customer maintenance, for example. If you assign a limited user access to that customer maintenance task, and they go into customer maintenance, it's going to say they don't have rights to it. So again, if you have a salesperson and they need access to that customer card, they're going to have to be a full user. They won't be able to be a limited user. Enable disable user is a new feature. Prior to this, you could only delete a user. If a user or if an employee left the company, there's a decision that you have to make as an organization. How do we remove their access from GP? Some people like to leave their login information in there, maybe just change the password. There's obviously a risk to that. Someone could potentially go change their password, log in, and make changes as them rather than doing it as themselves. So this disable is a little bit cleaner way to do that. So things like you want to consider like maternity leave, for example. So if you have a user, if you have an employee that's leaving for a long period of time, you might consider actually going in and disabling that user while they're gone, so that nobody can go in and make changes, and then enable that user again. Or if you have a temp work or seasonal work, you might create all those temp people and enable and disable them as they come on and as they go off. So you don't have to delete them to get them out, but you can disable them now. As far as profiles, if you've inherited environment from somebody else and you don't know what they've done, you can kind of set it back to the way it comes out of the box, and then and then mess with it from that point forward. So I'll talk a little bit about the outmod profile and what it means to security, but basically that's a new feature for GP 2013 and higher. All right. So talk a little bit about user setup. You can copy access, copy roles and tasks and company access to another users. I would encourage you to do that. This is, like I said, rather than creating Sally's role, you certainly can. You can go in and create one role for a user, for a specific user. If you hire another person that has the same information as them, you can copy that access to that other person. So if you get a pretty complex security model and you end up assigning 4 or 5 or 10 roles to a user, and what you can do is certainly copy that information over to the other user. Obviously, one thing you want to be careful of is a lot of people will say, oh, give them the same as Jane's access or give them the same as this access, rather than evaluating what Jane has access to, because they might have been elevated for certain other jobs that they no longer do or that this new user doesn't do. So you want to make sure you evaluate the role or task before you do that copy. There's the status, active, inactive lesson user. I talked a little bit about that already. The lesson user is just, that's for the lesson user company. So if you have the test company, Fabricam, used to be the World Online, you can create a lesson user, and if you're training or someone needs access to that test company to go in and train, you can assign them lesson user without using a license, but again, you can inactivate them as well. The SA user, so out of the box, and I mentioned this a little bit already, but out of the box you have full access to SQL and GP. So that SA user is assigned power user in Dynamics. That can be removed if you want to, but they also have out of the box full access to your backend. So what you want to do is limit that access to your DBAs or to your administrators if possible. So again, the way you can do that is to create a named user. So there's a SQL role that's called sysadmin, and if that role is added to your GP login, that will give you all of the additional privileges that you need to create users and companies. So I definitely encourage you to do that. The biggest advantage to doing it that way versus using SA is that your GP user, you cannot use that user to log into SQL directly, so you can't use that username and your password to get into SQL Server. So you're limited by the things that you can do in the GP environment. So from an enterprise risk perspective, you can tell your DBA, look, you're giving me a SQL admin or SQL admin role, but it's not giving me access to do anything in SQL. Everything would be in the GP environment. So so you can kind of lobby to get yourself that elevated access to get you into that position where you don't have to log in as SA. Anybody use the remember users? I always ask this, and very few people use remember users. This was their attempt, Microsoft's attempt at single sign-on, and it didn't go very well. Really, they're just remembering the password that they typed in last time. So so you can use this. You need to use it with caution. Obviously, it opens that up so that your payroll administrators, like if they were to save their password, then somebody else could go in and log in as them. So you definitely want to use that with caution. So now we're going to get to the point where we're going to talk about, setting up your roles and going through this security implementation. And like I said, I have a matrix, a security matrix. All it is all of the tasks that are out of the box in a spreadsheet. So, for example, maintain customer is one of the tasks. That task is the only task in GP that's assigned to edit a customer. So I feel that when I evaluated all of those tasks, that those tasks were a pretty good starting point for security implementation. The roles that are out of the box are very, very broad and typically have much too much access for a specific user in your organization. Not only that, but that role really was so general or so generic for an organization, it's not a representation of what that person or what a person in your organization does. And I can say that because it's not specifically geared to any one organization, and all organizations are so different. So you definitely want to look at the tasks, look at those task levels, and see what those tasks do. So a typical implementation would be basically to go and evaluate, to create a user role. I have an AP clerk. What does this AP clerk do? Go look at all the tasks, have them go through and check all the tasks that they do, creating a customer, maintain a customer, maintain vendor, whatever the task is. You go create a role for them. It's called the AP clerk role, or AP clerk without this particular function. That could be a type of role, and then have them go through and test that role, see how it works for them. As they have denied access to Windows, you can add tasks or potentially augment those tasks. As if they have too much access, you can remove some of those tasks. So again, I usually start from an implementation perspective at that task level and go from there. Again, the power user, I'm just going to say it again, limit that role to the system administrator. There are people that don't have any power users in their organization. Again, they can elevate your access and then remove that access from that environment as needed. So as long as someone has access to the security model, right, to be able to go in and assign roles, you can always have that person assign power user and then remove that. From a compliance perspective, that's the best practice. So as far as copying, there's kind of two sets of thoughts about copying roles and tasks prior to using them. You can do those. Typically, what I like to do is to leave the task alone and just use that task, unless that task has too much access. So there are a few tasks in Dynamics that are kind of catch-all buckets. One of them is the task that allows you to release a batch. It has posting, it had all kinds of stuff in there. So what I did was I just went in and said, okay, I'm going to take this one feature out of this task, create my own task. So I copied the task and then removed all the stuff that I didn't want in there and renamed that task something more appropriate to what it actually did. Again, you could do things like copy a task and then remove that access and then name that task something related to what that access or how you changed that task. Those are all good ideas as far as copying the task and making that task something specific to what you want. But in general, again, I try not to change the tasks. The reason I do this is because if Dynamics, if Microsoft upgrades or adds new features, adds new windows, they need to put those somewhere. And what they're going to do is they're going to assign those to to one of the out-of-the-box tasks. So the issue with that is you have to evaluate that, because when you do an upgrade, they're just going to grant this privilege to that task, and if you don't want that user to have that window, they're just going to be automatically assigned it. So the safeguard against that would be to go ahead and copy that task, rename it something entirely different, and then you don't have to worry about Microsoft changing that task ever in the future as far as that security. So a couple of different schools of thought there, but roles, I usually just start off with new roles. I start off with roles that represent the user that I'm trying to set up, and then copy the tasks if necessary. I've done it both ways based on what the needs of the organization were. There's risks both ways. There's risks of not getting new enhanced features automatically added one way, and then there's risks of having these access changed during an upgrade, and how do we evaluate that and make sure that we're not at risk of granting somebody something that they shouldn't have. And then they've added a newer feature, display selected roles. So you can display only the roles that you've selected, or only the selected tasks at the top, so you can kind of, it's a little easier to get through your list if you do that. All right, so all mod profiles. So what this is doing, and it's a little bit confusing, but what you're doing is you're actually choosing what version of the modified or alternate report or form that you want the person to see. So the alt mod profile selection doesn't have anything to do with security. It doesn't grant the user permission to a window. It doesn't remove that user's permission. It just simply tells which version of the form or report they should see. So if, for example, I have a modified customer maintenance window, I've modified it to remove the save button, or I've modified it to add some features. If I want a user in my organization to be able to see that modification, I need to assign them a mod alt profile with that modification selected. If I don't want them to have it, I need to select like the original form or maybe an alternate form. So you have the alternates. You have a lot of third parties out there that have completely changed the way a window looks. If you have users that say, you know, this user over here doesn't see the same form as I do, what's the deal, or how come I can't see this? You want to look at the mod alt profile and determine which one each one of them have. You can have as many mod alt profiles as you want. Different versions of different reports. Sometimes this invoice, and another user has to print this invoice. So those invoices would each be part of a different mod alt profile. So you would select that for them. So the SQL admin role That's the role that I talked about earlier. It's a SQL Server role in SQL Management Studio. That's the role that you need in order to give you essentially SA privileges that you need, creating user, creating a company, provisioning, maintenance, and so that's what's going to give you that ability. If you create users in your organization in GP, then you definitely need this role to be assigned and not log in as SA. All right, so I mentioned the security reports were fairly lacking in your Dynamics GP environment. There are a few in there. They're getting a little bit better. There's user security, and that report will just kind of tell you what a user has access to. It's a fairly large report, so it's hard to slice and dice it. So it's hard to do things like tell me all the people that have access to vendor maintenance, because it's hard to pick that one form from that perspective. There's also the task assignment, the role task report, which is okay. There's, and I'm gonna, one of my last slides is all the resources for you. One of those resources is a knowledge base article. It's called FAQs of role-based security. That has a really good query in it. If you have access to your SQL environment, or if you want to have your DBA create a report for you, or even a smart list, you can go and create a smart list that is all of the security reporting. That security is it's going to be able to be sliced and diced. You can have any, obviously you can utilize that report in any way. So it's definitely a lot easier to deal with it when it's in a report or in a smart list than it is from a report writer perspective. And then they add this new report. One risk to you is as you're managing your security, or maybe somebody else has managed your security previously, if you unassign a form or a report from a task, and that was the only thing it was assigned to, it kind of disappears in GP. So it's hard to get that back. It's hard to see that information. It's kind of a bug in GP, but there is a report called Unassigned Security Operations. So you want to make sure that you run that report and view all of those unassigned operations and make sure that those get assigned to tasks appropriately. You don't want a new feature for GP that you don't want to be not using that feature simply because it's not assigned. All right. So, so here are the questions to consider when we're talking about security, and again, it can be a very large process, but you want to make sure as an organization that the person responsible for changing security or granting access and security understands the internal processes and procedures. Are your risks documented as an organization? Do you have a rule set that says that hey, if this person shouldn't have access to vendors and create a payables check, that should never happen. So if the person creating security assigns that access, they could be putting the organization at risk. So you definitely want to document what types of security that you want to avoid granting, and you want to make sure the person in charge of implementing security understands those risks and understands that just because someone says they want or need access to something doesn't necessarily mean that they do. So obviously, segregation of duties, obviously with our products, makes it much easier because we can slice and dice that and pull those out. Without our products, it becomes very difficult to evaluate those SOD conflicts and stay on top of those. But if whether it's a manual process or an automated process like ours, the manual process still needs to be followed. You still have to understand those risks. So, can you answer the question, who has access? What do they do with that access? Who has access, it should be defined after you go through this security implementation, right? So you should be able, you should, at the end of it, know all the people that have access to create a vendor, all the people that have access to create a customer. What did they do with that access has to do with audit trail, really. And or reporting on the backside if there's a review and approval. So if you're running access reports or you're running reviews in terms of what a person's doing in the system, you can do that. It's obviously easier with audit trail. Audit trail is going to give you specific what someone did. Did they go and create a customer? Did they go and create a vendor? The before and after value of that vendor. And then the biggest thing is proof. Auditors want to know, auditors don't want to come in and ask the question, who has access, or show me your access reviews and have you go, oh, well, here's all the reports of all of our access. No, they want to know that you understand your risks and that you've been running those reports and that you know that only these 3 people have had the ability to create a vendor in the past year. And we're evaluating that risk on a quarterly basis. So every quarter we go through and we do a critical access review, and we understand that these are the people that have access to do this, and we're doing those access reviews. So that's the biggest thing with auditing and with auditors. We want to make sure that you can prove that you're on top of your access reviews, that you're doing them, that you have documentation that you're doing them, and that you understand what risks your organization has and what you're doing about those risks. So I've talked quite a bit about some of the tools earlier. There is an activity tracking in GP that you can use. It's a native tool. I like to use this when I'm setting up a new user. I grant them access to their tasks. I set that to a role. I go into my test system. I have that user perform their job. I turn on the denied requests to open a window tracking. And what it's going to do is it's going to, every time that person hits access denied, it's going to log the window that they didn't have access to. It's going to be in that SY0 5000 table, but there's also a report. So without even asking them how it went, you can go look at that report and see what they didn't have access to, augment their security, go change, go add a task, or go add a form to a task, have them rerun that, and it's a cycle. It's a rinse and repeat. So we're rinsing and repeating all of that information until we get their role in such a way that they can do everything that they need to do. Another really good tool to do that exact same thing that's much more powerful is the support debugging tool. It's called GP Power Tools now, and like I said, David Musgrave wrote this, and I believe McCorma is managing it now. It's something on the lines of $1 a day or $365 or something. So it used to be free. Now you have to purchase the product. But you can go out to, there's a link there, the Winthrop DC products, and you can see all that information. What's really good about this, you have that security profiler. It's much better than the activity tracking. You can go through and run through a specific process, and it'll actually create a task for you based on everything that you did. It also gives you the ability to import and export security. So if you're doing a security implementation, and you should do that in test, for example, you're testing all of this like I described. When you get that role set up, you can export that role to out to XML, go into your production environment, import that role. That way you're not changing the production environment and during the testing process. So it's really good for that. The FAQ article I mentioned that's a reference to that. And then, of course, the minimizing the use of SA. You can see that as well. I'd be happy to send any of this information to any of you that want it. Quickly before I run out of time, and if we have any questions, leave a little bit of time for questions. This is the security matrix. It's just a screenshot of it. What I've done here is on the top, these are the tasks that are out of the box. So you have a fixed assets general user, for example, or fixed asset reports. That's the name of the task. There's different tabs, so all of the tasks that are represented in GP are on the last tab. So you can quickly go find, if I search for customer maintenance on that last tab, it's going to show me what task that's in. Then I can create a role on the left, AP manager. They go through and put X's on the things that they do. We go ahead and create a role for them, and then test it through the processes, use activity tracking, use the support debugging tool. That's the general way that I go through and I implement security there. All right, so I mentioned questions. There's my email address. If anybody wants to email me, send me. I can send you my deck or any of the other resources I mentioned in this slide. So thanks for participating, and if there's any questions, Trish, I'd be happy to ask them.
I haven't seen any questions yet. You can always raise your hand or you can type them into the chat box. And just a reminder, we did record this and we will send out the link to everybody as well in case you had people on your team that missed it. But I don't think there's any questions, Jeff. So again, Jeff's email is up there if you still have questions afterwards. Otherwise, thanks for attending and thanks for leading us, Jeff.
You bet. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.